Our first speaker is the President of the National Association of Secretaries of State and the Secretary of State of Minnesota, Mark Ritchie. Mark is going to lead off a discussion in which we've asked the speakers to focus on the most important things as far as the MOVE Act is concerned, how it impacted their state, what worked, what didn't work, and what can be done to improve military and overseas voting. And with that, Mark Ritchie.
Thank you very much, and thank you to OVF for pulling us all together. The single most important thing about the MOVE Act in Minnesota was that it gave us the political muscle we needed to complete our agenda that we had for fundamentally altering the way that our military and overseas voters participate in our elections. When I was elected and walked into the office in 2007.
Mark, please excuse me. If the state speakers wouldn't mind going to the podium, then we can all see you, and the cyber community can watch you. Okay, thank you.
That's a big negative. In 2007, I walked into my office, and literally sitting on my desk was a letter from Department of Defense, from the Federal Voting Assistance Program, addressed to my predecessor, and it said, this is our 8th year or 9th year of sending you more or less the same letter. Minnesota's great, you have great turnout, but in terms of helping our soldiers and others serving in the military voting, you suck. And here's 10 things that you should do to change that situation. Now, I knew a little bit of this because I'm active in our local chapter, the VESI chapter of the Association for the U.S. Army. I worked very closely with our voting assistance officers in our local Guard unit and in our reserve unit there. We have both the Air and Army, and in that way I knew a kind of a general framework of the problem, but I didn't know the framework of solutions, and FVAP laid out a set of solutions that were so clear. We literally turned that letter over to the reviser, and the reviser started writing legislation to put those into practice. Forget the question, why hadn't anyone done anything for all those years? Why did we allow this situation to go on? I have no idea, like, why that is, but in any case, we had promised in the campaign to do something. FVAP gave us the raw material, the ideas of what to do. We put that into legislative language, most of it. A couple things didn't apply to our state specifically. We took it to the legislature, it got good support, and it was passed, and it was vetoed. And in the veto message, you know, there was just a lot of, you know, some, you know, like general language and that kind of thing. But there were some specific things. I spoke with the governor particularly about the question of our very late primary. We had a September primary. We wanted to move that to August to give us a reasonable amount of time. He said no one would vote in the summer, and you know there was all kinds of things. There was attempts to say, okay, if you just restricted to people in the uniform, that would be okay. But of course, in Minnesota, we have a huge number of military contractors serving in Iraq. Most of our soldiers, after they are done, have become military contractors of some kind. It just seemed wrong, especially the carrier of this bill was speaking at the funeral of a military contractor from his district who was killed in Iraq, serving our nation in that way. It just seemed like wrong. So anyhow, but the governor said, you know, work on this, come back again, let's take another look at this. So the following year, we were able to get most of that agenda passed. And of course, the core of that was the electronic transmission of the ballots and some simplification, getting rid of the witness, the way we did the witness that was hanging people up and some other things. But we didn't try again on the question of the date of the primary because we knew we did not have the governor's support on that. We implemented that bill. We had incredible success with that in '08. It was passed and got implemented. The electronic transmission was incredibly important. And we also had a special website. OVF helped us put together a website. We had a tripling of our military voting between the elections, and we had a much lower rate of rejection by mistakes made by our voters from the overseas as compared to those who were domestic. Some part of that is that we implemented absentee ballot boards for all overseas voters. You know, there were some things that we did, but also it was just a kind of more care, I think, that people put into it. But in any case, the critical question remained the late ballots. I think we had 500 and some that were late in '08. And there were all kinds of other reasons why we needed to address the question of that narrow time frame. Not to mention the fact that we've had a few statewide recounts. We had a recount in a primary. If you have a contentious recount in a primary in a state with a tiny window, you have some big problems on your hands. And we're a state that takes these problems very seriously because we've had 3 statewide recounts, not to mention some tied races and a whole bunch of small ones as well. So anyhow, the MOVE Act gave us the political muscle because the MOVE Act made it a media and public interest matter. No longer can people hide behind, well, people won't turn out in August or whatever. All of a sudden, this difference between the promise of our nation and what we were delivering in terms of democracy was in the newspapers, it was in the headlines, and it became impossible for politicians to hide behind whatever they were hiding behind. And it became possible for us to pass the change of date of our primary. So we made great success in implementing part of our agenda that came to us from FFEP, but we couldn't get it all done until we got that push from the MOVE Act. In 2010, we were able to move the date of the primary. Yes, it took a lot of reorganization to do all of that. But our end result was really great. Keep in mind, we're not a state with a base, so we have some active duty, you know, recruitment battalions, that kind of thing. But mostly we have Guard and Reserve. And we had in Minnesota in 2010, I think, I mean, I'll just give you the military ones. We had about, pull out the bigger printed numbers here so I can read them. We ended up with 700 military ballots, and 35 were late. And our rejection rate for mistakes made was less than 0.5%, or right at 0.5%. For our non-military but overseas voters, we had 1,300, 105 late. So a higher percent were late from citizens not in the military, and again, about a 0.5% rejection rate. With the citizens, the non-military is a little under 0.5%, and with military a little over, but our typical absentee ballot absentee rate has come down from 4% to 2%, but it's still way above our UOCABA. And a part of that is that we had the absentee ballot boards. When ballots came in with 46 days to go, if there was a mistake made, they were contacted. They were able to get ballots turned back in. We had a very high success rate in terms of people bringing them back. So the MOVE Act gave us the oomph we needed by providing a public demand for addressing this real failure or this gap between our democratic promise and the reality. What can be done to continue this improvement? There's a couple things that are really important from our perspective. One is that it's really important that we continue to distinguish between the electronic transmission of ballots and the sort of tendency of the media to just say electronic voting. We have these headlines about electronic voting in New York, and they're talking about optical scan tabulators. People would come in and see our ACU, our AutoMark machines, and say, oh, that's computer voting, we don't want that. And we'd have, you know, phone calls and protests and, And so when people are meaning electronic transmission of ballots, fax or email or otherwise, and the return through the mail or whatever system, which is what we use, and it's incredibly successful for us. If they get mushed together, we're going to have nothing but trouble. I'm in a state, and I work in an agency that has been the victim of SQL injection attacks from China, period. And I'm not the only one in the room. And so the whole notion that we're going to open up our system to these external attacks from who knows where is not a minor matter. And anyone who has the responsibility and has to face the voters, this is a serious thing. So I want to make sure the MOVE Act keeps communicating about the transmission part, but not mushing these together. A second is the MOVE Act has been, it's a way for us to remind ourselves about public service and the necessity of closing the gap between the promise and what we're doing. And, you know, it's the sesquicentennial of the Civil War. My state was Civil War had a huge impact on my state. Abraham Lincoln's portrait is the central portrait in our state capital. But one thing about it is that we're all familiar in Minnesota with the story that absentee voting in our state came because Lincoln was afraid he was going to lose, and he wanted to make sure soldiers could vote for him. And while that was a partisan matter, and it was done for a partisan purpose, it helped to advance very much the whole question of voting for all citizens. The Revolutionary War was fought by farmers and mechanics and all kinds of people. After the war, most were denied the right to vote, but some of those soldiers rebelled, especially in New York, and they got the right to vote. And so we've used the military and the service in the military to advance the right to vote. When I was 18, I couldn't vote, but I could carry armed nuclear-tipped missiles in Germany. I could fight in Vietnam, but I couldn't vote. And that demand, if we can go to war, we can vote. You have the right to draft us, but we don't have the right to select you. That was a powerful voice in bringing the franchise to 18-year-olds and older. So if we continue to use this vehicle of MOVE to keep advancing the civil rights and the electoral rights of our citizens overall, and we're quite clear that we're talking about closing the gap between the promise of democracy and the way it functions, we will continue to find better ways to do what we're doing now. The letter from FFAP that was on my desk had for us the critical elements for solving this problem for our state on a very cost-effective basis, and we're really proud that we did it. And at the final press conference where we're announcing the new earlier primary and all this, and the governor and everyone was like sloppy, huggy. I mean, it was unbelievable. You would never know there were vetoes. And the press said, "What is with this kumbaya thing?" I think the governor said, "This is a very special subject. It was tough fought. We compromised. We came together, and we all feel great." And I totally endorse that. Is exactly. It was hard fought, but when we did come together, and that's the last thing about the MOVE Act, it sort of forced us to have a bipartisan way of coming together to figure out how to deal with something in democracy that's not working. So thank you very much to whoever made the MOVE Act happen.
Okay.